If we're going to understand how sex and gender develop, we're going to have to understand some of the basic building blocks. And we'll start with genes and work our way into how the reproductive tracts develop. Those of you who have never had a class on genes, this is going to be a basic introduction. Those of you who have already had this class, I still advise you to pay attention because I try to go over a few things that you don't go over in a Bio 101 class. When we talk about genes, what we're really talking about is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. This is the blueprint for your body, the blueprint for everything that you will end up being as you develop. It codes for information about how you should develop. DNA looks like what you see on the right side here. It's a double helix, meaning that there are two strands going around. And in between each of those strands, you have these base pairs, these nucleic acids. And what they do is they match up with one another, such that, as you can see here, adenine will connect with thymine, but adenine doesn't connect with the other ones. And then only guanine connects with cytosine. I will not expect you to remember adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, but I want you to know that these base pairs hook up, they connect together. What this creates is a code. If you were to look across this strand of DNA, what you'd see is a series of, say you were looking at just one strand on one side of the double helix. What you'd get is a series of different types of nucleic acids where you might, in a string, have thymine, then cytosine, then guanine, then thymine, then adenine. And so you have this long code of different letters. Well, the way DNA works is it's a blueprint, and this is the code. When your body needs to create something, it will rip apart that DNA, it'll read the code, create something from that code, which will then float, it'll detach and float out in the cytoplasm of the cell into the rest of the cell, and it'll start creating proteins. I skipped over a lot of detail there, but again, I want you to know precisely what you need to know and not more. So the DNA is a blueprint. When it needs to be read, it gets pulled open, it gets copied, and then that copy goes out and it creates what needs to be created. So then you've probably heard of genes. What is a gene? Well, a gene is going to be a very particular sequence within that DNA. It's going to be part of that blueprint. So let's say that you need to code for how your eyes are going to look, what color your eyes are going to be, or what reproductive tract, whether you are going to have a male reproductive tract or a female reproductive tract, which one is going to develop. There are particular genes, sequences, parts of that blueprint that code for that information. You then have chromosomes, and chromosomes, what these are is they are a kind of a packaged collection of DNA. So when your DNA is in your body, if you are not actively dividing a cell, creating new cells within your body, the chromosomes are packaged up very, very tightly. And ultimately, when you package up all the DNA within one single cell, what you're going to get is 46 of these packages. So 46 chromosomes. And you're going to get 23 from mom and you get 23 from dad. The sperm that meets egg, the sperm contains those 23 from dad. The egg contains the 23 from mom. That's how you end up getting 46. You combine the 23 from each of those gametes from the sperm and egg to create a new organism. 46. There's a 23rd chromosome that is specialized for determining how someone is expected to develop sexually. These are called the sex chromosomes, so the 23rd. And these have a particular gene that, so each chromosome is going to be considered either X or Y. And because you're going to have two of these chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad, you're going to either have two X chromosomes, or you're going to have an X and you're going to have a Y chromosome. You can see on the right side that this is how these can end up pairing off. Where if you have an X, so if you have at the very top you see egg and sperm labeled. On the left side we can see that the egg had an X chromosome, and then the sperm had the X chromosome of the dad. If those two meet, what you end up getting is a child that tends to develop as a female or a woman. If you get an X from mom, and your mom will always contribute an X because she only has double X, and a Y from dad, and those combine, you'll then create a male child who has XY. So the first step in determining biological sex is, which chromosomes did you inherit? Did you get XX or XY? So the gametes, the ovum, the sperm, they contain a random copy of one sex chromosome from mom and dad. Mom always contributes X. Men contribute either X or Y. Now on the Y chromosome, what makes it special is this particular gene called the sex-determining gene of the Y chromosome, and we abbreviate that as SRY. Very simply, if this is present, if this gene exists, it's really less about the chromosome overall and more about the gene. If the gene is there, then that directs sexual development along a male pathway. So really what determines whether you turn into a male, whether you will tend to develop as a male or not, is going to be the presence of this gene, whether you have this Y chromosome. Okay, you have the genes, but it goes beyond that, right? It's not just whether you have the genes or not. We determine whether someone tends to be male or female based on their genitalia, their reproductive tracts. What? Do they have a uterus? Or do they have that internal vas deferens and testes? Do they have an ejaculatory duct? Or do they have fallopian tubes, et cetera, et cetera? So let's track how these internal reproductive tracts develop over time. So from conception is sperm and egg meeting. So from conception to 6 weeks, there's no difference between men and women. In fact, the reproductive tracts, the gonads, such as the testes and the ovaries, they look the same. At this point, they're considered gonads. At 6 weeks, these gonads will begin to specialize. They'll develop and specialize. If you have an XY chromosomes, you will tend to develop testes. And if you have XX chromosomes, you'll tend to develop ovaries. What you then are going to get are two pairs of ducts, that is tubes, that extend from the gonads to the site of where the external genitalia will eventually be. So let me show you this real quick. This is what I'm describing. At the very top here, this is the undifferentiated internal reproductive tract. You have the gonads, but it's not clear whether they're testes yet, testicles, or whether they're ovaries. You then have these different sets of ducts extending down towards that kind of oval cylinder at the bottom. That would be the site of the external genitalia. So you have these ducts extending downward. And there are two types of ducts. You have Mullerian ducts and Wolffian ducts. The Mullerian ducts are the precursor to the female reproductive tract. So if you have Mullerian ducts and they don't go away, eventually they will develop into the uterus, the fallopian tubes, and connect to the ovaries. If you have Wolffian ducts and they don't go away, these will turn into the vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, and all of the machinery that is within the male reproductive tract, the prostate, etc. So you can see from this chart that both men and women actually start with both of these ducts. So what has to happen is one of these ducts needs to dissolve. It needs to go away. This is how that happens. If you have testes, that is, you are XY, you develop male gonads, you develop testes, the testes are going to produce a particular hormone. And that hormone is called anti-Mullerian hormone, AMH. And that does exactly what you think it does. It degenerates the Mullerian ducts. So as long as you have testes, the Mullerian ducts will dissolve, and therefore the Wolffian ducts will stick around. And so you get the male reproductive tract. For women, what happens is whether the Mullerian ducts, so for women what happens is because they don't have testes, they are not producing as much testosterone as men would. And so when there's an absence of testosterone or there's not a high concentration of testosterone, what you see is that there is a degeneration of the Wolffian ducts. So let's look at this here. Let's say you take the male pathway. You develop testes, and the testes are going to produce that AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone. Because you're producing that hormone, the Mullerian ducts go away, and the Wolffian ducts stick around. Therefore, eventually, these develop into the testes, vas deferens, you get the seminal vesicles, the ejaculatory duct leading into the penis, ultimately. For the female path, you have ovaries, but the ovaries are not really what's causing the Wolffian ducts to dissolve. It's the absence of the testes. It's the absence of that testosterone. So when you don't have testosterone, or a lot of testosterone, the Wolffian ducts dissolve. And because you don't have testes, you're not producing AMH. And because you're not producing AMH, the Mullerian ducts will stick around. Those hook up to the external reproductive tract or external genitalia. So what you have are these ovaries connected to the oviducts or the fallopian tubes, which lead into the uterus, which lead out into vagina. This is how the internal reproductive tract develops. And the details here are important because in the next lecture, we're going to talk about what goes wrong in the development of these reproductive tracts. And it'll be important to know how these ducts dissolve or not, whether you end up having Mullerian ducts or Wolffian ducts. Looking at the external genitalia on the outside, first, the important thing to note is that these develop from the same early tissues. So during that phase from conception to 6 weeks, I said that the gonads have not developed yet, and this reproductive tract at the very top looks exactly the same. Well, so do the external genitalia. So from about 4 weeks after conception, what you see is in the top of this image. You have a genital tubercle, which is the thing that will eventually either turn into a clitoris or a penis. You have genital swellings, which will eventually turn into either the labia majora, those kind of thicker lips around the vulva surrounding the vagina, or turn into the scrotum, the sac that holds the testes. You'll have a cloaca, which is not yet an opening, but this is going to either turn into the vaginal canal or it's going to seal shut in men. And then you have the urethral fold, which will clearly turn into the urethra eventually. Well, what happens around week 6, which again is when the gonads are starting to form, you start to get testes and ovaries, which start to produce hormones. You're going to start to see this thing change shape, where instead of this cloaca, you now have what's called a urogenital sinus. And again, it's not quite a vagina yet, but it's also not sealed off. What you'll see, though, is that it'll pinch kind of near the bottom. And so what you get is a hole where the vagina might form, but then you also get another hole, and that is how the anus forms. This is actually one of the reasons why anal stimulation can actually produce sexual arousal. You can find it enjoyable to have anal sex, is that the tissue that ultimately leads to your penis and vagina and everything down there, that also is sensitive. That same tissue is going to create your anal tissue as well. So many of the same nerve endings are going to be there. That's why that can be sensitive. All right, so what does this look like? The difference between whether you develop external male genitalia or external female genitalia depends on the concentration of testosterone. What's going to determine that? What produces testosterone? The gonads, the testes. So it's going to depend on whether you have these testes that are producing high amounts of testosterone. All right, if you have high testosterone, what you see is that the glands at the very top, if you follow the arrow down, the glands is eventually going to develop into the glands of the penis and part of the shaft. The urethral groove and those bits there, they are going to seal together, and they are going to create the shaft and everything leaning down to the scrotum and testes. You're then going to have those scrotal swellings around the sides that drop down a bit and become saggier and end up turning into the scrotum where the testes are stored. If you are not exposed to testosterone in the uterus while developing at this time, about 5 months in, you'll develop the female genitalia, such that the genital tubercle decreases in size and becomes the glands of the clitoris. The urethral folds and the genital swellings, the urethral folds will actually stay there. They will not fuse together, and those will form the outside labia majora and labia minora of the vulva. And then, of course, that'll stay open. You'll have the hymen and everything else that is specialized to the female external genitalia. So this is the difference here. It's the same tissue. It's simply whether that tissue is exposed to testosterone or not. All right. These gonads are coordinating a lot of this, but let's talk about what exactly they're doing. So 10 weeks, rewinding the clock just a little bit, 10 weeks after conception. For both men and women, they're positioned near the top of the pelvis. So not really far up in the abdomen, but near the top of the pelvis. In women, the ovaries are going to descend slightly after birth. So that is, they're near the top of the pelvis, they descend slightly. In men, it's a little bit different. In men, the testes begin to descend into the pelvis around 6 to 7 months after conception, so not after they're born yet. So they start to descend, then after birth, they descend even further into the scrotum. So when a child is first born, when a baby boy is first born, the testes may not yet be in the scrotum. It's only slightly afterwards that they descend. And when they descend, what they do is they draw out that spermatic cord. Remember that kind of thick bit of tissue that had lots of muscle and blood vessels and nervous tissue that extends from the body cavity down into the testes. And in there you have vas deferens, you have blood vessels, you have nerves. So that descension actually pulls all of that equipment down there with the testes so that the testes can live relatively kind of further away from the body. There is an interesting disorder called cryptorchidism, where the testes do not descend. Well, this is going to cause a number of problems, most clearly infertility. So if the testes are not further away from the body, they're going to be at body temperature. And, not going to edit that out. And if they're in the body and they're producing sperm, that sperm will not be able to survive at that temperature. And so you will be infertile because you are not producing sperm, or at least the sperm are not surviving. There's also a chance of cancer. The gonads should not be up there. So the gonads may be releasing certain types of hormones in places where it should not be released, or in concentrations that where you shouldn't have that amount of the hormone in it. And so if that's the case, that kind of activity where it shouldn't be can lead to uncontrolled cell growth or cancer. It can be corrected with surgery, though. Again, really the problem here is just that the testes are not descending as they should, so you can surgically go in and essentially drag them down to where they need to be. So this is correctable. Okay, finally, I want to make a quick note about puberty. Everything we've just talked about is something called primary sexual development. That is, it's the first wave of hormones that you're exposed to. Either you're exposed to testosterone or you're not exposed to it, and that shapes your reproductive tract, it shapes your external genitalia. That's the first line. Puberty is what's called the secondary wave of sexual hormones. So these are secondary sexual characteristics that develop around puberty. This is when you get that second wave. Around this time, from about birth until puberty, boys and girls are actually very similar in a lot of ways. Certainly they look a little different, but psychologically speaking, they get along in a lot of the same ways. They have a lot of the same behaviors. And so around puberty, you see this surge in either testosterone for boys or some amount of estrogen for women, estrogen and progesterone. And these are going to lead to characteristics like breast development, pubic hair, the voice deepening, and then a number of psychological traits too. Girls tend to go through puberty earlier, so from about age 8 to 13, and it'll end around 14. Then boys go through it later. This explains that weird sensation or interaction you can have when, say, you're in middle school and suddenly all the girls are taller than the boys, and at least for just that moment, they have the height advantage, and usually the maturity advantage as well. But then boys catch up a little bit later on, ages 12 to 14, ends around 15 to 16. So there is a difference here, and be aware that that difference exists. Puberty begins when the gonads begin secreting sex hormones. And so what's initiating here is sexual maturity. The point of puberty is to prepare the body to reproduce. Once you go through puberty, men will start producing sperm at a greater tick, and women will start ovulating. They'll start to have their period. And so sperm and egg can meet at that point. So puberty is sexual maturity. And at this time, there are a number not only of biological changes, but psychosocial changes. That is, changes to your psychology, how you think, as well as kind of how you fit within society as well, and culture. A lot of cultures consider puberty an entrance into adulthood. And that makes a lot of sense, right? If you are suddenly now capable of reproducing, you are capable of creating another organism that you might be responsible for. So at that point, you should be considered an adult because you have a great responsibility, potentially. About this time, you see an increased interest in sex, and of course that makes sense. If you are reproductively viable now, that is when people are going to want to start using this new capability that they've discovered, this interest in sex, this capability of reproducing. And I really want to note this. This is when you see greater intrasexual competition. This is something that I think, unfortunately, for a lot of people, they only realize in retrospect, looking back on puberty. But this is when people start getting nasty with one another. Women will start competing with women. Guys start competing with guys. This is when the hierarchies start to build. If you are now reproductively viable and you can reproduce, you're going to start competing for the best partners, for the best sexual and romantic partners. And so this is when you start seeing more intrasexual competition. All right. This wraps up the basics of the biology of sexual development. Next class, we'll start talking about some deviations or disorders from typical development.